She thought she was humiliating a nobody, but in less than 10 minutes, the entire room would realize they had just insulted the most powerful woman in it. The Beaumont Investment Gala glowed beneath towering crystal chandeliers, their golden reflections dancing across polished marble floors as laughter and quiet deals filled the air, the kind of room where every handshake could move millions of dollars and every glance silently measured worth, status, and influence, and into that world stepped Eleanor Hayes, her presence so understated it almost felt like a mistake, her navy dress simple, unbranded, falling cleanly to her knees, her shoes practical, her hair pulled back without effort, as if she had no intention of competing with the spectacle around her, and yet there was something in the way she moved, calm, precise, unhurried, that didn't quite match the image people quickly assigned to her, but no one looked long enough to notice, especially not Charlotte Beaumont, who stood at the center of it all like she owned the night, draped in a tailored ivory gown that caught every flicker of light, her diamond bracelet glinting as she lifted a glass of champagne, her smile sharp, curated, and just slightly too practiced, because Charlotte didn't just attend events like this, she dominated them, and the moment her eyes landed on Eleanor, she paused mid-sentence, her gaze drifting slowly from Eleanor's shoes to her face, assessing, calculating, and in less than a second, deciding, and that decision came with a faint smirk. The kind reserved for people who didn't belong, well, Charlotte murmured to the small circle gathered around her, her voice low but perfectly pitched to carry just enough. It seems someone wandered in from the wrong side of town. A ripple of soft laughter followed, glasses hovering in the air, eyes flicking back toward Eleanor, not openly staring, but not subtle either, the kind of attention designed to make someone feel smaller without a single direct confrontation, and Eleanor noticed, of course she noticed. But her expression didn't change, her eyes steady, her posture relaxed, as if she had long ago learned that silence could be more powerful than reaction, and still she continued forward, weaving through clusters of tailored suits and designer dresses, the faint echo of heels against marble trailing behind her, until she reached the registration desk, where a young attendant hesitated just slightly. Before offering a polite smile, "Good evening, welcome to the Beaumont Gala, may I have your name?" And before Eleanor could answer, Charlotte's voice cut in, smooth and sharp like a blade wrapped in silk. "I'll handle this," she said, stepping forward, her presence immediately shifting the air around them, the attendant straightening, stepping back, while Charlotte positioned herself just close enough to block Eleanor's path without making it obvious, her smile widening, though it didn't reach her eyes. "This is a private event," she said, her tone light, almost conversational, but with a weight underneath it that made several nearby guests turn their heads, sensing the tension beginning to build. "Invitation only," she added, tilting her head slightly as if giving Eleanor a chance to correct a mistake, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to lean in, conversation softening, the faint hum of music becoming distant, because everyone loved a quiet spectacle, especially one that confirmed their place at the top, and yet Eleanor didn't step back, didn't stammer, didn't apologize, she simply met Charlotte's gaze, calm, unshaken, as if the words hadn't landed the way they were intended to, and that alone created the first crack, subtle, almost invisible, but there, because people like Charlotte were used to immediate reactions, embarrassment, retreat, something to validate their judgment. And when it didn't come, it unsettled something deep beneath the surface, though she masked it quickly, her smile tightening just a fraction. "I'm afraid we have standards here," Charlotte continued, her voice lifting slightly now, enough for those closest to hear clearly, "and we do like to maintain a certain atmosphere." Another soft laugh, another ripple of agreement, and still Eleanor didn't move, her eyes drifting briefly across the room, taking in the chandeliers, the polished floors, the carefully curated crowd, as if she were seeing it from a different perspective. Entirely, not as a guest hoping to belong, but as someone evaluating something that already belonged to her, though no one there could have guessed that, not yet, and as the silence stretched just a second too long, the air tightening with anticipation, something shifted at the far end of the room, a figure moving quickly, purposefully, cutting through the crowd with an urgency that didn't match the relaxed elegance of the evening. And though most hadn't noticed yet, Eleanor had, her gaze settling briefly in that direction before returning to Charlotte, her expression unchanged, patient, almost curious, as if she were waiting for the exact moment everything would begin to unravel, and Charlotte, still unaware, lifted her glass slightly, preparing to deliver the final, dismissive line that would end the interaction on her terms, completely unaware that in the next few seconds, the entire room would fall silent for a very different reason. Charlotte's glass hovered in the air for just a fraction longer, her smile fixed as she prepared to dismiss Eleanor with the kind of polished cruelty that left no room for argument, but before the words could leave her lips, a voice cut sharply through the low hum of the room. "Miss Hayes," the tone urgent, controlled, and carrying far more weight than its volume suggested, and suddenly conversations nearby faltered. A few heads turning toward the source, a senior partner from Beaumont Holdings. Moving quickly across the marble floor, his pace brisk enough to break the unspoken rule of effortless elegance that governed the evening, his expression tight, almost anxious, a detail that did not go unnoticed by those who understood how rarely men in his position showed anything resembling urgency. Charlotte's smile flickered for the briefest moment, irritation replacing confidence as she lowered her glass slightly, clearly displeased at being interrupted, but still unaware of what was unfolding. "I am in the middle of something," she said coolly, her voice edged with authority as she glanced toward him without fully turning, signaling that whatever he had to say could wait, but he did not slow down, did not defer, and that alone created a subtle ripple through the nearest guests, the kind that spread without words, drawing attention without spectacle, until he stopped just beside Eleanor, not Charlotte, and for a heartbeat, no one spoke, the silence stretching thin, delicate. "Like glass about to crack, Miss Hayes," he repeated, this time softer, but unmistakably respectful, his posture shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible yet impossible to ignore, shoulders slightly lowered, head inclined just enough to signal deference, and in that moment, something changed in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because power recognizes power long before it is announced, and the people who understood that began to look closer. Charlotte's brows tightened, confusion threading through her expression as she finally turned fully toward Eleanor, really looking at her now for the first time, not as a misplaced guest, but as a variable she had not accounted for, and Eleanor, still calm, still composed, met the man's gaze with a quiet nod, as if this interruption had been expected all along. "You are early," he said, his voice measured, careful. "We were preparing for your arrival," and the words landed differently than anything that had been said before, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy, carrying implications that began to settle over the room like a slow realization. Charlotte let out a small, incredulous laugh, attempting to reclaim control. "I think there has been some confusion," she said, her tone light but edged, glancing between the two of them as if correcting an obvious mistake. "This event is by invitation only," and yet even as she spoke, the confidence that had filled her voice moments earlier was beginning to thin, because the man did not look at her when she spoke, did not acknowledge her correction, his attention fixed entirely on Eleanor, waiting, and that silence in response was louder than any contradiction. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, their earlier amusement fading into something more cautious, because the atmosphere had changed, subtly but unmistakably, and Eleanor, after a brief pause, reached into her bag, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if she were operating on a timeline only she understood, and for a fleeting second, Charlotte considered interrupting again, asserting control, restoring the balance she believed had been disrupted, but something held her back, something in the stillness of Eleanor's demeanor, the quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself, and so she watched, along with everyone else, as Eleanor withdrew a slim leather folder, its design understated, elegant in a way that did not rely on logos or embellishment, and handed it to the man, who accepted it with both hands, his expression tightening further as he opened it, scanning the contents quickly, his eyes moving with focused precision, and then he nodded once, sharply, as if confirming something already known but now made official. "Everything is in order," he said, his voice low, almost to himself, yet audible enough in the silence that had fully taken hold of the surrounding space, and now the room was no longer pretending not to watch. Conversations had stopped entirely, glasses held midair, breaths caught between moments, because whatever this was, it was no longer a private exchange, it was something unfolding in real time, something that demanded attention. Charlotte's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, the faintest tremor betraying the shift in her composure, though her posture remained upright, controlled. "What exactly is going on here?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more measured, as if choosing each word carefully, but there was no answer for her, not yet. Because Eleanor had not looked at her once since the interruption began, her focus steady, her presence anchoring the moment without effort, and then, with a simple motion, Eleanor took a pen from the folder, its metallic surface catching the chandelier light for just a second before she pressed it to the paper, signing her name with smooth, practiced ease, no hesitation, no flourish, just a single, decisive action, and as the pen lifted, the man exhaled, a subtle release of tension that spoke volumes to those who noticed such things. "It is done," he said, louder this time, his voice carrying just enough to reach beyond their immediate circle, and that was when the first true crack of realization spread through the room, because deals were made quietly in places like this, but decisions of consequence echoed, even in silence, and Charlotte, standing just a step away, felt it before she understood it, the shift, the imbalance, the unmistakable sense that something fundamental had just changed, though she could not yet see how, and Eleanor finally turned her head, her gaze meeting Charlotte's for the first time since the moment began to unravel, her expression calm, almost gentle, but there was something beneath it now, something unmistakable, something that made it clear that whatever Charlotte had believed about her just minutes ago had been profoundly, irreversibly wrong, and the room held its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. Charlotte felt it before she could name it, the unmistakable sensation of control slipping through her fingers as Eleanor's gaze settled on her with quiet certainty, not confrontational, not aggressive, but steady in a way that made it impossible to look away, and for the first time that evening, Charlotte did not immediately respond, her mind racing to reframe what had just happened, to reinterpret the signals in a way that restored her authority, because people like her did not lose control. In rooms like this, not publicly, not ever, yet the silence stretching around them refused to cooperate, it pressed in, heavy and expectant, as more guests turned fully now, no longer pretending disinterest, drawn into the unfolding moment like gravity had shifted, and the senior partner, still standing beside Eleanor, cleared his throat slightly, a small sound that carried weight in the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured but firm, the kind of tone that signaled something official without raising volume. "We will be making a brief announcement," and that was enough to send a ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, glasses lowering, conversation stopping entirely, every eye now fixed on the center of the scene. Charlotte's chest tightened almost imperceptibly as she forced a composed expression back into place, lifting her chin slightly as if to reclaim her position, though the ground beneath that confidence had already begun to shift, and Eleanor, without rushing, turned her attention toward the gathering crowd, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, almost understated, yet now impossible to ignore, because something about her had been redefined in the span of seconds, not by words, but by recognition, the kind that could not be faked, the kind that moved silently through a room of powerful people and made them pay attention. "As of this evening," the man continued, pausing just long enough to let the weight of his words settle, "the Beaumont investment portfolio has been formally acquired." A murmur stirred, low and uncertain, because acquisitions of that scale were not small events, they were seismic shifts, the kind that altered hierarchies overnight, and yet no one had expected to hear such news announced like this, in the middle of a gala designed to celebrate stability and prestige. Charlotte's fingers tightened again around her glass, the faint sound of crystal under pressure barely audible, her mind immediately searching for context, for explanation. Because her family name was attached to that portfolio, her influence rooted in it, and the idea of it changing hands without her knowledge felt impossible. "The acquiring party," the man said, his voice steady, though a trace of tension lingered beneath it, "has chosen to finalize the transition in person," and now the room was completely still, the kind of silence that held anticipation and disbelief in equal measure, because there was only one question left unspoken, and everyone was asking it at once: who? Charlotte's gaze snapped back to Eleanor, the pieces beginning to align in a way she did not want to accept, her earlier words echoing faintly in her mind, the dismissiveness, the assumption, the quiet cruelty, and for the first time, doubt broke through her composure, sharp and unwelcome. "That is not possible," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but strained at the edges, though no one responded, because the answer was already unfolding in front of them. Eleanor stepped forward just slightly, not dramatically, not for effect, but enough to shift the focus entirely, and in that small movement, the balance of the room changed, power settling where it had not been recognized before, her eyes moved briefly across the crowd, not seeking approval, not demanding attention, simply acknowledging the reality of the moment, and then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying effortlessly through the silence without the need for force. "It is always possible," she said, and the simplicity of the statement landed harder than any grand declaration could have, because it carried no need to prove itself, only to exist. Charlotte felt the words like a quiet impact, her breath catching just slightly as the final pieces fell into place, the realization no longer avoidable, the truth standing fully formed in front of her, and around them, reactions began to ripple outward, subtle at first. A widening of eyes, a shift in posture, a quick exchange of glances between those who understood exactly what had just happened, because in rooms like this, recognition traveled faster than explanation, and once it arrived, it could not be undone. The laughter from earlier now felt distant, almost inappropriate, replaced by a careful, measured silence, as if the entire room had recalibrated in an instant, and Eleanor, still composed, still unshaken, met Charlotte's gaze one last time in that moment. Not with triumph, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet clarity that made everything that had happened before feel small, irrelevant, and completely exposed, and Charlotte, standing in the center of it all, understood with a sinking certainty that she had not just misjudged a stranger, she had revealed something about herself that no amount of wealth or status could conceal, and the room, now fully aware, was watching to see what she would do next. Charlotte felt it before she could name it, the unmistakable sensation of control slipping through her fingers as Eleanor's gaze settled on her with quiet certainty, not confrontational, not aggressive, but steady in a way that made it impossible to look away, and for the first time that evening, Charlotte did not immediately respond, her mind racing to reframe what had just happened, to reinterpret the signals in a way that restored her authority, because people like her did not lose control in rooms like this, not publicly, not ever, yet the silence stretching around them refused to cooperate. It pressed in, heavy and expectant, as more guests turned fully now, no longer pretending disinterest, drawn into the unfolding moment like gravity had shifted, and the senior partner, still standing beside Eleanor, cleared his throat slightly, a small sound that carried weight in the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured but firm, the kind of tone that signaled something official without raising volume. "We will be making a brief announcement," and that was enough to send a ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, glasses lowering, conversation stopping entirely, every eye now fixed on the center of the scene. Charlotte's chest tightened almost imperceptibly as she forced a composed expression back into place, lifting her chin slightly as if to reclaim her position, though the ground beneath that confidence had already begun to shift, and Eleanor, without rushing, turned her attention toward the gathering crowd, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, almost understated, yet now impossible to ignore, because something about her had been redefined in the span of seconds, not by words, but by recognition, the kind that could not be faked, the kind that moved silently through a room of powerful people and made them pay attention. "As of this evening," the man continued, pausing just long enough to let the weight of his words settle, "the Beaumont investment portfolio has been formally acquired." A murmur stirred, low and uncertain, because acquisitions of that scale were not small events, they were seismic shifts, the kind that altered hierarchies overnight, and yet no one had expected to hear such news announced like this, in the middle of a gala designed to celebrate stability and prestige. Charlotte's fingers tightened again around her glass, the faint sound of crystal under pressure barely audible, her mind immediately searching for context, for explanation, because her family name was attached to that portfolio, her influence rooted in it, and the idea of it changing hands without her knowledge felt impossible. "The acquiring party," the man said, his voice steady, though a trace of tension lingered beneath it, "has chosen to finalize the transition in person," and now the room was completely still, the kind of silence that held anticipation and disbelief in equal measure, because there was only one question left unspoken, and everyone was asking it at once. "Who?" Charlotte's gaze snapped back to Eleanor, the pieces beginning to align in a way she did not want to accept, her earlier words echoing faintly in her mind, the dismissiveness, the assumption, the quiet cruelty, and for the first time, doubt broke through her composure, sharp and unwelcome. "That is not possible," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but strained at the edges, though no one responded. Because the answer was already unfolding in front of them, Eleanor stepped forward just slightly, not dramatically, not for effect, but enough to shift the focus entirely, and in that small movement, the balance of the room changed, power settling where it had not been recognized before. Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd, not seeking approval, not demanding attention, simply acknowledging the reality of the moment, and then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying effortlessly through the silence without the need for force. "It is always possible," she said, and the simplicity of the statement landed harder than any grand declaration could have, because it carried no need to prove itself, only to exist. Charlotte felt the words like a quiet impact, her breath catching just slightly as the final pieces fell into place, the realization no longer avoidable, the truth standing fully formed in front of her, and around them, reactions began to ripple outward, subtle at first, a widening of eyes, a shift in posture, a quick exchange of glances between those who understood exactly what had just happened, because in rooms like this, recognition traveled faster than explanation, and once it arrived, it could not be undone. The laughter from earlier now felt distant, almost inappropriate, replaced by a careful, measured silence, as if the entire room had recalibrated in an instant, and Eleanor, still composed, still unshaken, met Charlotte's gaze one last time in that moment, not with triumph, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet clarity that made everything that had happened before feel small, irrelevant, and completely exposed, and Charlotte, standing in the center of it all, understood with a sinking certainty that she had not just misjudged a stranger, she had revealed something about herself that no amount of wealth or status could conceal, and the room, now fully aware, was watching to see what she would do next. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like a room adjusting to a truth it had not prepared itself to face, and Charlotte stood at the center of it, her posture still composed, her chin still slightly raised, but the certainty that once defined her presence had thinned into something fragile, something that no longer commanded the same automatic respect, because now every glance directed at her carried a different weight, no longer admiration, no longer alignment, but quiet observation, the kind reserved for someone who had just made a mistake too visible to ignore. And Eleanor, without shifting her calm demeanor, stepped forward just enough to close the invisible distance between them, her movement unhurried, deliberate, as though time itself adjusted to her pace, and the senior partner beside her instinctively moved half a step back, creating space, not out of instruction, but recognition, because authority does not need to announce itself when it is fully understood, and Charlotte felt that shift more than she saw it, the subtle repositioning of people, the recalibration of attention, the way conversations did not resume but instead held, suspended, waiting for what would come next, and for the first time that evening, she spoke without complete control. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," she began, her voice steady but no longer sharp, the edges softened by uncertainty, "I am sure it can be clarified privately," the suggestion hanging in the air like an attempt to contain what had already spread too far. But Eleanor did not accept the invitation to minimize the moment, did not retreat into discretion. Instead she regarded Charlotte with the same composed stillness, her eyes steady, not unkind, but undeniably clear. "There is no misunderstanding," she replied, her tone even, quiet, yet carrying effortlessly through the room. And that was enough to close the door Charlotte had tried to open, the possibility of this being resolved quietly dissolving in an instant, because truth, once spoken in the open, does not return to private spaces, it remains where it was revealed, and now it belonged to everyone watching. Charlotte's fingers loosened slightly around her glass, the tension in her grip easing not from comfort, but from the realization that control had already been lost, that this moment was no longer hers to shape, and around them, reactions continued to ripple outward, subtle nods, exchanged looks, the quiet language of a room that had already begun to rewrite its internal hierarchy. Because power in spaces like this is not only about wealth, it is about perception, and perception had shifted completely. Eleanor was no longer an outsider to be dismissed, she was the axis around which the room now turned, and the weight of that realization pressed gently but firmly into every corner of the gala. Eleanor's gaze moved briefly across the crowd, acknowledging the attention without seeking it, and then returned to Charlotte, who stood just a step away, still processing, still trying to reconcile the image she had formed minutes ago with the reality now unfolding in front of her. You spoke about standards, Eleanor said, her voice calm, measured, each word placed with intention, not to wound, but to illuminate, about who belongs and who does not. The room held its breath again, not from tension now, but from anticipation, because this was no longer about a transaction. It was about something deeper, something that resonated beyond numbers and portfolios. Charlotte swallowed subtly, the movement small but visible, her composure intact on the surface, yet undeniably altered beneath, and Eleanor continued, "It is interesting," she said softly, "how quickly those standards change when the facts do," and there was no accusation in her tone, no raised voice, no overt challenge, and that made it land harder, because it left no room for defense, only reflection. The kind that happens in silence. Charlotte's eyes flickered, searching for a response that would restore balance, that would return her to the position she had occupied so confidently just moments before, but none came, because anything she said now would only confirm what had already been revealed, and that realization settled over her with quiet finality. Around them, the room remained still, no laughter, no whispers now, only the soft hum of a space that had shifted into awareness, and Eleanor, seeing that the moment had reached its natural conclusion, did not press further, did not extend the discomfort. Instead she simply inclined her head slightly, a gesture so minimal it might have gone unnoticed in any other context, but here, now, it carried the weight of closure, not triumph, not victory, but completion, as if a lesson had been delivered without ever being declared. And as she turned slightly, the senior partner stepping into alignment beside her, ready to continue the evening under a new understanding, the room did not immediately return to normal, because normal had changed, permanently, and Charlotte, still standing where she had first intercepted Eleanor, understood with quiet clarity that wealth could command attention, but respect, once lost in a moment of arrogance, was far more difficult to recover, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with recognition, the kind that lingers long after words are gone. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire room had been gently paused and was waiting for permission to breathe again, but Eleanor did not look back, she simply continued forward, her steps measured, quiet against the marble floor, and something about that movement made it clear that she had nothing to prove, nothing to reclaim, because what mattered had already been revealed, and that realization settled deeply into the crowd, reshaping the atmosphere in a way that no announcement ever could. Conversations did not resume right away, instead they returned slowly, cautiously, voices lowered, tones adjusted, as if everyone present had become suddenly aware of how easily perception could betray them, how quickly assumptions could unravel, and the subtle hierarchy that had once defined the evening now felt less certain, less stable, because one quiet presence had shifted the entire balance. Without raising her voice once, the senior partner walked beside Eleanor with a visible respect that no longer needed explanation, guiding her toward the inner section of the gala where only a select few had access, and this time, no one questioned it, no one blocked her path. The same space that had moments ago seemed closed to her now opened effortlessly, and that contrast did not go unnoticed, especially not by Charlotte, who remained standing exactly where she had been, her posture still composed, but her stillness no longer commanding. Now it felt different, heavier, as if she were anchored in place by the weight of what had just occurred. Her gaze followed Eleanor across the room, not with disdain, not even with anger, but with something far more difficult to conceal, recognition, the kind that comes too late to change the outcome. A few guests who had laughed earlier now avoided her eyes, turning slightly, redirecting their attention elsewhere, subtle gestures, but in a room like this, they spoke volumes, because respect, once shifted, rarely announces its departure, it simply moves, quietly, to where it believes it belongs, and tonight, it had moved completely. Charlotte lowered her glass slowly, setting it onto a nearby tray with care, as if the simple act required more focus than it should, her mind replaying the interaction, the words she had chosen, the assumptions she had made, each detail sharper now in hindsight, stripped of the confidence that had once justified them, and for the first time in a very long while, she found herself without an immediate strategy, without a way to regain control of the narrative, because there was no narrative left to control, only reality, and it had already been witnessed by everyone who mattered. Across the room, Eleanor paused briefly as another executive approached her, greeting her with a level of respect that bordered on deference, their conversation quiet, composed, entirely natural, as though this was exactly where she had always belonged. And perhaps that was the most striking part of all, there was no grand display, no attempt to assert dominance, only a quiet presence that required no validation, and that presence now defined the tone of the entire event. The laughter that returned was softer, more measured, the conversations more careful, as if every word carried a new awareness behind it, because no one wanted to be the next person who misjudged what they did not understand. Charlotte finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, and straightened slightly, her composure returning in form, if not in substance. She adjusted her posture, her expression smoothing into something neutral, practiced, but even as she did, she understood something that could not be undone, that power built on perception alone is fragile, easily shaken when confronted with truth, and that evening had exposed that truth in the most public way possible. She glanced once more toward Eleanor, who now stood at the center of a different kind of attention, not forced, not demanded, but given freely, and in that moment, Charlotte realized that what separated them was not simply wealth, not numbers or status, but something far more fundamental, the quiet certainty of knowing who you are without needing anyone else to confirm it, and that was something no title could grant, no invitation could secure. As the evening continued, the gala resumed its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It carried a subtle shift, a recalibration of values that would linger long after the lights dimmed and the guests departed, and though no one spoke openly about what had happened, they would remember it, not as a scandal, not as a spectacle, but as a moment of clarity, a reminder that dignity does not announce itself, and that the people most easily overlooked are often the ones who hold the greatest power. And somewhere in the quiet center of it all, Eleanor Hayes moved through the room without urgency, without display, exactly as she had entered, simple, composed, and entirely undeniable. By the time the evening settled into its new rhythm, the shift in power had become something no one could ignore, not because it was announced again, but because it quietly dictated every interaction that followed. Conversations adjusted, tones softened, and even the most confident voices now carried a layer of caution, as if the room itself had learned a lesson it was not eager to repeat. And at the center of that unspoken awareness, Eleanor Hayes remained exactly as she had been from the moment she arrived, calm, composed, and entirely uninterested in performing the kind of authority others expected. She moved through the inner circle of the gala with a quiet ease, exchanging brief words with executives, acknowledging introductions with a polite nod, never lingering longer than necessary, never raising her voice, and yet each interaction carried weight, because the people speaking with her understood exactly who she was now, not just in title, but in presence, the kind of presence that did not demand respect, it simply received it. And that difference changed everything. A group of investors nearby lowered their voices as she passed, their earlier confidence replaced with careful consideration, while a senior advisor subtly stepped aside to give her a clearer path, gestures small in isolation, but together they painted a picture that no announcement could fully capture. And across the room, Charlotte Beaumont watched it all unfold with a growing clarity that felt both sharp and unavoidable. She had spent years mastering the art of controlling perception, of reading rooms and shaping narratives before anyone else had the chance, but tonight, for the first time, she found herself on the outside of that control, observing rather than directing, and what she saw unsettled her in a way she could not easily dismiss. Because Eleanor was not behaving like someone who had just secured a powerful acquisition. There was no display, no subtle reminders, no effort to reinforce her position, and that absence of performance made her authority even more undeniable. It was not constructed, it was inherent. Charlotte's gaze followed her as she paused near a small group of board members, listening more than speaking, her expression attentive, thoughtful, as if she valued what was being said rather than waiting for her turn to assert dominance. And that, more than anything, highlighted the contrast between them. Because Charlotte had always believed that power required visibility, that it needed to be seen, acknowledged, reinforced, but Eleanor moved as though none of that was necessary, as though the truth of her position existed independently of anyone else's recognition, and that realization settled heavily, forcing Charlotte to confront something deeper than a simple misjudgment. It was a flaw in the very foundation of how she understood influence. A quiet voice beside her broke the stillness. One of her associates, speaking cautiously, "Did you know?" he asked, his tone careful, almost hesitant, and Charlotte did not respond immediately, her eyes still fixed on Eleanor. "No," she said finally, the single word carrying more weight than it should have, because it was not just an answer, it was an admission, and admissions like that were rare for someone in her position. The associate nodded slightly, as if that confirmed what he already suspected, and did not press further, because the room itself was already providing all the answers that mattered. Eleanor shifted her attention once more, offering a brief handshake to an older executive who greeted her with visible respect, their exchange quiet, efficient, and as she turned to move again, her eyes briefly scanned the room, not searching, not measuring, simply observing, and for a fleeting moment, her gaze passed over Charlotte, not lingering, not dismissive, just a calm acknowledgement, and that brief contact was enough. It carried no judgment, no superiority, but it held a clarity that Charlotte could not ignore, because it reflected exactly what had happened without needing to say it, and in that instant, Charlotte understood that the moment of humiliation had never truly belonged to Eleanor. It had been hers, revealed not through confrontation, but through contrast, and the room, now fully aware, had quietly adjusted its alignment accordingly. The music continued, the lights still shimmered against the marble floors. And the gala carried on, but beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed, the kind of change that would linger long after the night ended, shaping future conversations, influencing decisions, reminding everyone present that status could be assumed, but dignity could not be fabricated. And as Eleanor Hayes continued through the evening with the same quiet composure she had entered with, the lesson remained suspended in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable, that true power does not need to announce itself, because it is revealed in the moments when others choose to underestimate it, and the room, now fully aware, would not forget it. The evening continued, but for Charlotte Beaumont, time no longer moved the same way. Every second felt heavier, stretched by the quiet awareness that followed her now, not openly, not cruelly, but persistently, like a mirror she could not turn away from. And as she finally stepped away from her original place near the entrance, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor, she noticed something subtle yet unmistakable. The way conversations shifted when she approached, not stopping entirely, but adjusting, voices lowering, tones becoming more measured, not out of respect alone, but out of caution, because the room had seen something it would not easily forget. And in spaces like this, memory had a way of influencing behavior long after the moment had passed. Charlotte paused near a small group of familiar faces, individuals who had once aligned themselves closely with her, their smiles polite, their greetings intact, but there was a hesitation now, a fraction of a second, where certainty used to be, and that fraction was enough to confirm what she already understood, that influence, once questioned, does not return in the same form. It returns carefully, conditionally, if at all. She offered a brief nod, maintaining composure, engaging just enough to fulfill expectation, but her attention was elsewhere, drawn inevitably back to Eleanor Hayes, who stood now near the far side of the room, speaking quietly with a senior board member, their exchange composed, efficient, and entirely unforced, as if this environment, this level of power, had always been her natural setting. And perhaps that was the truth Charlotte had failed to see, not because it was hidden, but because she had never considered the possibility that simplicity could exist alongside such authority without needing to advertise it. Eleanor shifted slightly, concluding the conversation with a calm handshake, and as she turned, her path once again aligned toward the center of the room, and this time, there was no obstruction, no hesitation from anyone around her. Space opened naturally, almost instinctively, as though the crowd itself recognized the need to step aside, and Charlotte watched that movement closely, not with resentment, but with a growing clarity that felt sharper with each passing moment, because it was not Eleanor's wealth that commanded that response, it was her presence, the quiet certainty that did not seek validation, and that distinction mattered more than Charlotte had ever realized. A voice broke her thoughts again, softer this time, one of the older investors who had known her family for years. "These things happen," he said, his tone neutral, neither dismissive nor sympathetic, simply observational, and Charlotte inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the comment without fully accepting it, because she understood that what had happened was not an accident, it was a consequence, a reflection of choices made in a moment where she had believed herself untouchable, and now that belief had been exposed, not destroyed, but altered in a way that could not be ignored. Across the room, Eleanor paused once more, her gaze moving briefly through the crowd, not searching for approval, not measuring reactions, simply observing with the same calm awareness she had carried from the beginning, and for a brief second, her eyes met Charlotte's again, and this time, Charlotte did not look away. She held the gaze, steady, composed, but no longer guarded in the same way, because something had shifted within her as well, not a loss of identity, but an adjustment, a recognition that strength does not always present itself in the forms she had trusted. Eleanor gave the slightest nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed by anyone not watching closely, and then she continued on, her attention moving forward, leaving the moment behind without lingering, without revisiting, and that, more than anything, defined the difference between them. Eleanor did not carry the need to prove what had already been established, she simply moved on, allowing the truth to settle on its own, and Charlotte, standing there, understood that the room would remember this night, not for the acquisition alone, but for the clarity it had revealed, the quiet dismantling of assumptions that had once felt solid. And as the music played on and the conversation slowly regained their rhythm, Charlotte took a measured breath, her posture steady, her composure restored in form, but now grounded in something more honest, less reliant on illusion, because for the first time in a long while, she was no longer reacting to maintain control, she was observing, learning, and perhaps beginning to understand that true authority is not built on how loudly one can define others, but on how clearly one understands themselves. And in that realization, the evening reached a different kind of conclusion, one that did not require applause or acknowledgement, only silence, the kind that settles after something real has been seen, and cannot be unseen. The gala no longer felt like a stage for display, it had transformed into something quieter, more reflective, as if every polished surface in the room now held a subtle awareness of what had unfolded, and Eleanor Hayes moved through that awareness without resistance, her presence no longer questioned, no longer measured, simply accepted, yet she did not linger where the attention gathered. She shifted instead toward a quieter corner of the room where the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in clean lines of light and shadow, a view that mirrored the clarity she carried within herself, and for a moment, she stood there alone, not isolated, but undisturbed, the hum of conversation behind her softening into a distant backdrop, as though the night itself had paused to catch its breath. Across the room, Charlotte Beaumont noticed the shift, the absence of Eleanor from the center drawing her attention more strongly than her presence ever had, and without fully deciding to, she began to move, her steps measured, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, but guided by something she had not felt in a long time, not ambition, not control, but the quiet need to understand. And as she crossed the marble floor once more, the same space that had earlier amplified her confidence now reflected something more grounded, something less certain but more real. A few guests observed her movement, their eyes following briefly, but there was no spectacle this time, no anticipation of conflict, only a subtle curiosity, because the tone of the evening had changed, and everyone seemed to recognize that whatever came next would not resemble what had come before. Charlotte approached the window where Eleanor stood, the city lights casting a soft glow that outlined her figure, and for a brief moment, Charlotte paused just a few feet away, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the quiet space Eleanor occupied, something she would not have considered earlier, and then she spoke, her voice lower than before, steady, but without the sharpness that had once defined it. You could have said something, the words simple, almost neutral, but carrying layers beneath them, not accusation, not defense, but reflection, and Eleanor did not turn immediately, her gaze still directed toward the skyline, as if considering the city itself before responding, and when she did speak, her voice matched the calm rhythm of the moment. About what, she asked softly, and the question was not dismissive, it was genuine, inviting clarity rather than conflict. Charlotte exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the ambient noise behind them. About who you are, she said, her tone more thoughtful now, less certain, as if she were testing the weight of her own words, and Eleanor finally turned slightly, enough to meet Charlotte's gaze without breaking the stillness of the moment. Would it have changed anything, she asked, and the question lingered, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to consider, and Charlotte did not answer immediately, because the truth was already forming in her mind, clear, undeniable, and difficult to avoid. It would not have changed the instinct, the judgment, the assumption made in a fraction of a second, and that realization settled between them, not heavy, not uncomfortable, but honest. Eleanor inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging the unspoken answer, and then she added, "People rarely believe what does not match what they expect to see," her tone calm, reflective, not critical, and Charlotte absorbed the words without resistance. Because they did not feel like criticism, they felt like clarity, the kind that does not accuse but reveals, and for the first time that evening, Charlotte allowed herself to fully step outside the role she had built, the position she had maintained for so long, and simply stand in the moment as it was, without needing to shape it, without needing to control it. "I misjudged you," she said finally, the words quiet, direct, and free of qualification, and Eleanor's expression did not change. Not because the words did not matter, but because they did not require a reaction, only acknowledgement, and she gave that acknowledgement with the slightest nod, a gesture that carried acceptance without superiority, and in that exchange, something shifted once more, not in the room this time, but between them, a balance restored not through power, but through understanding. The city lights flickered in the distance, steady, unchanging, and the quiet between them felt different now, not empty, but complete, as if the lesson that had unfolded throughout the evening had finally settled into place, not declared, not emphasized, simply present, and as Eleanor turned her gaze back toward the skyline, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same quiet certainty, Charlotte remained there for a moment longer, not as an observer now, but as someone who had seen something real, something that would stay with her long after the night ended, and when she finally stepped back, returning to the rhythm of the gala, she did so with a different awareness, one that did not diminish her, but refined her, and behind her, Eleanor Hayes remained by the window, exactly as she had been from the beginning, simple, composed, and entirely beyond the need to prove anything at all, while the room, now fully transformed by what it had witnessed, carried forward in a quieter, more thoughtful harmony, the kind that lingers long after the lights fade. By the time the evening began to draw toward its quiet conclusion, the Beaumont Investment Gala no longer felt like a display of status, but like a room that had witnessed something far more enduring, something that would outlast the champagne, the polished speeches, and the carefully curated impressions, because what remained was not the memory of wealth, but the recognition of character. And Eleanor Hayes moved through the final moments of the night with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning, offering brief farewells, acknowledging those who approached her with a calm nod or a few measured words, never lingering, never extending the moment beyond what it needed to be, as though she understood that true presence does not require repetition, it simply leaves an impression and moves on. The senior partner walked beside her once more as they approached the exit, his posture still respectful, his tone careful as he spoke softly about next steps, future meetings, transitions that would follow the acquisition, and Eleanor listened with the same steady attention she had given everything else, responding briefly, clearly, without embellishment, because for her, this night had not been about proving anything, it had been about completing something, and now that it was done, there was no need to revisit it. Across the room, Charlotte Beaumont stood near the center once again, but the space around her felt different, not diminished, but redefined. The people who approached her now did so with a more measured tone, their words polite, their expressions thoughtful, and Charlotte met them with a calm she had not possessed at the beginning of the evening, not forced, not performative, but grounded in a new awareness, because the lesson she had encountered was not one that could be dismissed or explained away, it had been seen, felt, and understood, and as she watched Eleanor near the exit, preparing to leave without spectacle, without drawing attention, Charlotte recognized something that had eluded her before, that influence built on perception can shape a room, but influence grounded in quiet certainty can transform it entirely. Eleanor paused briefly at the threshold, her hand resting lightly against the door as she exchanged a final word with the senior partner, and for a moment, the light from outside framed her in a way that seemed almost symbolic, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, like the closing of a moment that had already said everything it needed to say, and without looking back, she stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the room in a stillness that felt complete, not empty, but settled, as though the energy that had once filled it had been refined into something quieter, something more aware. Conversations resumed again, but they carried a different tone now, less certain, more thoughtful, as if each person present had adjusted their understanding in a way that would influence how they moved forward. Charlotte exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering on the closed door for just a second longer before she turned back to the room, her posture steady, her expression composed, but her perspective no longer the same. She understood now that what had unfolded was not simply a reversal of status, it was a reminder, one that could not be ignored, that dignity does not depend on recognition, and that the most powerful individuals are often the ones who feel no need to announce themselves. As the final guests began to depart and the lights softened, the gala came to its natural end, but the lesson remained, carried quietly by those who had witnessed it, shaping their thoughts long after the night had passed. And somewhere beyond the walls of that grand room, Eleanor Hayes continued on her way, unchanged, unshaken, exactly as she had been before she ever stepped inside, while behind her, a room full of people would remember, not the moment she revealed her power, but the moment they realized they had failed to see it. And that was the kind of truth that does not fade, it settles, quietly, and stays.